in general, first generation reforms refer to macroeconomic reforms, essentially to deal with problems of inflation, debt, high interest rates, and so forth, and to bring some kind of fiscal and monetary discipline. Second generation reforms tend to largely deal with microeconomic areas, and they tend to build the market economy, the infrastructure of the market economy, as well as increase efficiency, increase competitiveness, and create competitive markets, and at the same time strengthen the institutional and regulatory framework. Now, just to give you a few examples of what I'm talking about, let's just take trade reform. Trade openness, as you know, is the big issue in terms of structural reform, and we started that in the late 1980s and in the 1990s. And when you pursue trade liberalization, you start by first removing the import quotas, you reduce tariffs, and you improve export incentives. Those are more or less the first stage of trade reform. Then the second generation trade reform would deal with what you call behind the border issues, that is barriers behind the border, such as the protection of sensitive sectors, phyto and phytosanitary standards, technical standards, intellectual property, and so forth. So that's just an idea of when you say first generation and second generation. Another example, for example, would be the exchange rate approach. If you set the real exchange rate, let's say you float the exchange rate or you devalue the exchange rate in the first round, in the second round, you have to try to maintain it, and you have to follow the monetary and fiscal policies that control inflation in order to minimize the appreciation of that exchange rate. Similarly with privatization, in the first round, privatization and divestment usually touch on the less strategic or the non-strategic areas. And then later on in the second round, you tend to deal with the highly controversial strategic areas and assets, which are very difficult at times for the state to shed. So that's another example of second generation reforms. And we can also talk about this in terms of product pricing, transfers and subsidies and so forth, where you have that easy first phase where you tend to remove the less impactful subsidies, that is those that don't touch too deeply on social welfare and affect inflation and so forth. And then in the second phase, you tackle the heavy subsidies, which would be what you may call those that are sensitive to inflation, things like fuel subsidies and so forth. So with that background, we could begin to look at what are the structural measures that were taken to impact long-term growth in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, as I said, this represented a major shift from import substitution to export orientation. And in terms of growing a market-supported kind of economy away from state enterprises and engaging in trade and financial liberalization. So let's take, first of all, this issue of financial liberalization reforms. Financial liberalization was embarked upon from 1988 or more or less 1990s, really, in order to encourage positive real interest rates that would boost domestic savings and promote investment. The idea was to try to the idea was to try to allow interest rates to be determined more by the markets than by government control. And in that sense, you find that around that time, a number of reforms were introduced that would facilitate that. Government relied less on reserve requirements. They promoted much more open market operations. As a matter of fact, open market operations started around that time. There was a removal of restrictions on the capital account, and generally there were more freedom of monetary transactions. Now, I can't speak of all of this, but the most important one for me that I want to talk about is the one dealing with the liberalization of the exchange rate market. The TNT dollar was floated, and exchange controls were removed. The central bank eliminated the foreign exchange allocation allocation system, what we know as the EC0 system, which had been in place since 1983. This was done in 1993. This allowed the market to facilitate transactions. That is, one was free to go and purchase foreign currency, of course, at the price that was set. The dollar was devalued, as you would recall, from about 4.29 to 5.77. That is, as they open up the foreign exchange market, they then allow the exchange rate to climb to 5.77, and then they stabilize it at that point. As we know, it has moved ever since to 6.1, then I think 6.4, and then subsequently some years ago to 6.7. Now, the really effective rate, if you check it today, has appreciated quite substantially. The really effective rate, as in last year, for example, had moved to, on the index of 100 in 2010, it had moved to 130 in 2020. And in 2001, that is just some years after that flotation of the currency, it was 76.8. So one could see a substantial appreciation of the exchange rate over that time. So that it suggests to me that not enough probably was done to try to keep that exchange rate at a manageable level, and we have ended up with a highly appreciated exchange rate. Now, indeed, there have been some measures, and I want just to digress slightly to say that when I've read the statements from the government and some of the policy documents, what we see is an argument that what Roger likes to call, I say Roger, Dr. Hussain likes to call an internal devaluation. And there's a government policy and approach to this thing, and let's not kid ourselves and think that there's no approach. People who don't believe in devaluing the currency or floating the currency, they believe in some sort of alternative that will work. And what they did is to really sort of indulge in what you may call moderate spending. They had the budget in 2016 of 50 billion, and which was down from 63 billion in 2014. And they more or less kept it at that point up to today. I think in this last budget is about 52. They appreciated the exchange rates. Sorry, they devalued. They carried down the exchange slightly, as I mentioned, down from about 6.4 to 6.7, a marginal move, but a move nonetheless. And then they began to give a subsidized exchange rate to the exporters through the Exim Bank. Now, that is important to know that, because that's a way that people who indulge in internal devaluation, that is basically what they do. They try to give subsidies so that the effective exchange rate would be a little favorable to exporters. Actually, they do that in other countries. Barbados do that with the tourism industry, and that's a way that they try to make exports competitive when they know that the exchange rate has appreciated. They also indulge in freezing the public sector. In some cases, like in Barbados, you would send home a significant portion of the public sector. Here, what we have done is we have frozen public sector employment. There has been no employment now in the public sector for quite a while. We have also frozen wages and salaries. I would say probably from 2013, there are a significant number of workers in the public sector that have not been given any increase. And we have generally stopped paying contractors and suppliers and business people for their VAT refunds. There has been some VAT refunds through this bond system, but generally we have not paid these people. One could just imagine that if you had paid all these people, what the government spending would be like. I think I saw somebody did an estimate probably showing that this could be about as much as between $8 to $10 million. So for want of a better term, I don't know how we apply these terms internally. For want of a better, the government policy was to say, okay, let's dampen the economy, let's keep the economy under moderate expenditure, and in that way we could have a low rate of inflation, and over time the exchange rate would come back in some kind of alignment. Now, the hard fact is that it is not working, in the sense that, well, as I pointed out, if you see the exchange rate that the appreciated exchange that I pointed out is 30% above 2010, it means that it is not working. If you go back to 2001, it is probably about 50-something% over that. The second issue I want to take up, I'm just going to deal with about 4 of them because we can't deal with all, but just to give you an indication of the way structural reform is going. The second issue, which I think is a major one, and I remember in the 1980s, we were very, very adamant, or not adamant, but very kind of strident on this, and that was the question of privatization, divestment, and public-private partnerships. Now, roughly from 1987, there were about 30 companies by 1995 that was partially or fully privatized. Since then, I think the process has been stalled. The Road to Recovery team, which, just as you know, did that report, they looked at this and they came up with a program for what they call non-core assets. Non-core here would be the non-strategic assets, which could be considered for public-private sector partnership, as well as for open sale. There's a whole long list there. I don't have the time to go into them, but you could find them at table 5.2 in the second phase report of the Road to Recovery. They list a lot of them there, the banks, and certain things. Now, recently in the last budget, the government spoke about public-private sector partnership for the port. This port has been around, well, since I remember, you know, this port has been on over 30-something years. We've been talking about privatizing the port. We have been totally left behind because other countries in the region have gone that way years now, and they have developed very efficient and competitive ports. We have been left behind in that. We are now trying to play catch up, and we're still talking about it some years now. We talk about finding a buyer or finding a partner rather sometime in the coming year. They also talk about CL Marine, which was a CLECO company, a ship repairing company, trying to get a partner for that. And they talked about some shares in FCB, which are going to be put on the market. Now, as compared to what is in the Road to Recovery document, as I mentioned, and you can go there and consult it, where they talk about the hotels, Hyatt and Hilton and Magdalena, Stripfall, and all the airports and all of that. You could see that if you compare it with what is said in the budget, you would see where this is a very, very limited effort. That is to say, as compared to the 1987, we are really not in the second phase of structural adjustment as far as privatization and divestment is concerned. Quickly, let's turn to taxation. Taxation is another area where you find reforms are needed for growth. We basically shifted from trade taxes to VAT taxes, and we did this in order to offset the distorting effects of taxation on production and investments, and largely to compensate for the revenue that we were going to lose from trade liberalization in the 80s and 90s. The introduction of VAT reshaped the revenue structure, but it was unable to significantly broaden the tax base. And the latter involves largely looking for new revenue sources and trying to increase tax collection. Now, we have been talking a lot about broadening the tax base, but over the years, how much have we really done to do that? We've talked a lot about the property taxes that have been there, going up and down, and still around there. We have talked about the Revenue Authority. We're seeing some move to finally try to get it going there. But really, in terms of tax reform, if you think about what is required for the non-energy sector, for instance, there's an argument, and I saw where the IMF to some extent has been arguing that they're saying that you need a special regime for the non-energy sector. I would tend to think that there's an argument here in terms of how I see the kind of incentive structure you need to provide for tradables. And this could be done, let's say, for example, through the special economic zones, which have been on the books for some time. Jamaica has gone that route and so on, to be able to have a tax regime that is compatible with the WTO and acceptable by countries with whom you have trade agreements like the European Union. So in my view, we haven't really moved very much with respect to tax reform. And similarly, with respect to subsidies and transfers and product pricing, I won't go too much into this. We have flogged this really a lot about the skyrocketing trend in terms of Subsidies and transfers, as you know, it's roughly about 56% of the budget and has grown substantially from what it used to be years ago. 50% of your budget being spent on transfers and subsidies is something very worrisome. And while we have introduced some, under pressure, we have introduced some change with respect to non-diesel fuel subsidies. We still, in a sense, still grappling with this problem of how we deal with subsidies and transfers. I won't say anything about the utility transfers, but that's a whole discussion that could take us all night. But we know what is happening there with respect to water and electricity and so on, the kind of subsidies we have that are unsustainable, and we have to do something else. So in terms of second generation reforms, we can see that not much has happened there since 1988. Now, the other areas that I would like to talk about, which would be things like the public sector reform, the ease of doing business, the quality of the institutions. All of these are areas of structural reform which have to be dealt with. We have, in a sense, flawed this question of the ease of doing business. We know how much is still to be done there in terms of trading and in terms of access to permits and so forth, and payments and so forth. There's a whole long agenda there. There's some movement, that there's been some movement over the years, but qualitatively, it is certainly not enough. So there's an issue here that I think we need to frontally deal with if we want to get some kind of long-term growth in the future, as well as diversification. I won't say much about trade openness. I think trade openness may probably represent an area where we made some progress, in the sense that the first set of reforms were undertaken, that is the removal of quantitative restrictions, and then we tarified, we introduced a tariff there, and then we went on to do some behind the border, take some behind the border measures. For instance, we introduced a competition policy, a competition authority. We also established the regulations, for instance, with respect to phytosanitary and sanitary measures, with respect to intellectual property. We have regimes that are WTO compatible. And I believe that was done probably largely because of our adherence to the WTO agreement, which in a sense forced us to have to do these things. There's some countries in the Caribbean that don't do them, and there's some of the CARICOM countries, but to a large extent, the WTO ignores them because of their small size and their small weight in trade. But we have more or less gone along here. So there's, in a sense, some second stage kind of reform that you find in trade openness. And this may be an area of exception, although we have brought, we still have some restrictions in trade. We are not as open as probably we would like to be, but we have brought the average tariff down to about 10 or 12%, which was much higher before 1988. We have brought it down there at 10. And if you take into account the way the world has moved away from trade liberalization to one of even some protectionism today, you'll see that reasonably we have maintained a fair amount of openness. So I won't deal too much on that, just to point out that there the question of reform may be a little different. The quality of institutions, certainly there's a lot to talk about there, but I won't say too much about that. We could talk about the question of governance, the question of the independence of the institutions. All of these are critical. If you look at the IMF report, you would see where this is a major concern in terms of dealing with long-term structural growth. They emphasize a lot this question of the institutions. And this would take us an entirely new session if I have to point it. So I want to just briefly mention it. So let's say in conclusion, therefore, what we see is that we have made some progress in structural reforms, particularly in the 1990s, but the reform process has tended to slow down or even disappear in 2000, or rather, or after 2000. Gains were made from lower average tariffs and removing restrictions on the flow of international finance. Structural reforms, however, are still needed to improve administrative efficiency, alleviate the burden of doing business, and rationalize the utilities. Structural reforms are particularly needed to increase competitiveness in the non-energy sector and attract foreign and local private investment. So the basic conclusion is that there has been no transition from first generation to second generation reform, so second generation structural reform. The current structural reform process reflects a kind of undue and unnecessary gradualism. There seems to be a kind of caution being exercised here, which in a way suggests that you're not tackling the issues of structural reform. You're too concerned about treading on toes or something like that, affecting certain interests and so forth, are concerned about it would affect the social reality, in particular the vulnerable and the poor. The harsh reality is that we have dropped the ball, and at a time when second generation reforms were needed. Now, reform, as you may know, is a long-term process. It goes over 40 to 50 years. If you listen to the Chinese, they still talk about reform. They still talk about this, what they call the deep water phase of reform. That is to say, the deep water with the deep currents. They talk about the vested interest that builds up at each phase of reform. And now you have to fight that in order to move into the second phase. Well, maybe to some extent, this is where we are in terms of the reform. That is, we got stuck in after we discovered natural gas and LNG and all that sort of thing. And we didn't really sort of continue with the reforms that were necessary. We didn't even save enough in a sense, although we saved, I would say, a bit that allowed us to get through a bit the double whammy of the downturn of oil prices, as well as the COVID matter. But in a sense, the reforms that we needed to take, we did not really undertake there. And I really don't have an explanation for this. I would have liked to be able to offer you an explanation, but I would say some kind of political economy analysis may be helpful here. As I remember my colleague Dennis Panton used to talk about the rentier class, and to some extent it may be useful to look at that to see why, for example, that these second stage reforms were not undertaken. But I think I've tried to confine myself to, I see it's 7:30 now, yeah. So let me stop there, and I would like to have some discussion further on this matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez. I'm going to hand over now to Mr. Ramnarayan. Mr. Ramnarayan, go ahead and share your screen. And you may.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez, for that history of the economy and trade liberalization and so on. And, I just want to start off with the recollection that every time we come through October, I remember the Yom Kippur War. And of course, I can't remember the war because I was 1 year old. October 1973. And it was a war on the other side of the planet that greatly impacted the future of Trinidad and Tobago. And it is my belief that that war birthed the modern economy of Trinidad and Tobago. I could be challenged, but it's my view. And we went into the oil boom that lasted for the remainder of the 1970s, ended sometime around 1982, and went into a period of 7 consecutive years of economic contraction from 1982 or 1983 all the way to 1989. And the culmination of those 7 years of economic contraction was the attempted coup of 1990. And of course, today, today is the funeral of the leader of that attempted coup. So history comes full circle. And after 1990, we went into exploring the LNG industry, and the LNG industry started up in 1999, and we went into a phase of rapid economic expansion thereafter. This is about the time I bring on my graphs. So, all right, so I'm sharing the graphs, and are you all seeing the graphs?
Yes, they're being seen. Go ahead.
Right, well, I am not seeing my graphs, which is interesting, right? So you all seeing the first graph on the screen there?
No, I am not seeing them.
Kevin, the screen went to blue.
Oh, okay.
Was there just now?
So let me stop sharing.
And you can start back again.
Disconnect my secondary screen, which is the source of the problem. And share again my graph. All right, so you all seen it now?
Yes.
All right, okay. So that graph on the screen there shows there's quite a lot of information, and I've gotten very fond of using what I call waterfall graphs quite recently, because I discovered that it could be automatically generated now in Excel, and there's no longer manually drawn. So these graphs cover the 21st century, and the one on the left, which I assume you all could see, shows our real GDP at constant 2012 prices, and the changes in that real GDP at constant 2012 prices. So this data set takes constant GDP at 2012 prices and goes back all the way to the year 2000. So we're comparing apples with apples here, because there were two data sets in existence. One with constant 2000 prices, and the other one with constant 2012 prices. So this is all data in constant 2012 prices. And it shows, you know, a story which anybody who is familiar with the economic history of the last 20 years would know. We've gone from the year 2000, when the LNG industry was in its infancy, to a period of really steep economic growth that ended somewhere in the year 2007. And in the year 2008, we had the subprime mortgage crisis in the US, which affected all countries in the world. And you had the break in economic growth happening there in the year 2008. And then there was a plateauing period, I would say between 2009 and 2015, there was a plateauing. And then we've gone into contraction for the last 6 consecutive years. And so we've had a 6-year run of economic contraction, which is only surpassed by that 7-year period in the 1980s. So the last 6 years, this is the period 2016 to 2021, is, according to all the records I've seen, the second worst period of economic contraction in the history of this country. And that sounds pretty fatalistic, I know. But if you look at the graph next to it, the graph next to it is almost a mirror image of the GDP graph. And it shows quite clearly the relationship between natural gas production and GDP in Trinidad and Tobago. So clearly from the graph, you could see the orange bars are lining up with each other. So in the last 6 years, so let me start off by saying, in the last 11 years, from 2010 to the current day, we have had a 37% decline in natural gas production. Of that 37%, 19 of those 37%, of that 37% has come in the last 2 years. So the fall in natural gas production, if you look at the graph, you see 2 large orange bars there. That is 2020 and 2021. we have had significant falls in gas production in the last 2 years. And all that is affecting the GDP, affecting the revenue, and affecting, it trickles into every aspect of our life in Trinidad and Tobago. Right. The next graph is just really a close-up of the years 2012 to 2021. Again, as you could see, big drops in the years 2016 and 2017. And of course, the year 2020 would have been affected by the COVID-19 shutdowns and so on. This graph shows, this graph shows the revenue for the last 20 years. And again, it's a similar story. The first big orange decline would be, again, during the subprime mortgage crisis. Prices of commodities fell sharply, and so too did our revenue. And then there was a period of gradual recovery. And then, of course, again, prices again fall. So this graph is affected by oil production, gas production, oil price, and gas price. And you could see that the last 6 years, Trinidad and Tobago really has been coming down. So we've gone from a peak of revenue collection in 2014 of $58 billion. We've come down to collecting around $37 billion in 2021. So we've lost about $21 billion there in revenue collection. So it has not been, and I want to be fair to Minister Imbert, it has not been an easy time to be a Minister of Finance in Trinidad and Tobago. And I was remarking today that whoever is the government in 2025 is going to have a very difficult time running this country. And this graph shows the parallels between GDP and natural gas. And the point I want to make here is that at the end of 2021, our real GDP is going to be back where it was if you do the interpolations on the graph, our GDP is going to be back to where it was in 2006, and our gas production at the end of 2021 is going to be back where it was in 2004. So we've gone backwards. We've traveled backwards in time to the year 2006 and 2004 from a GDP and gas perspective. And from a revenue perspective, I can tell you that $37 billion collection of revenue in 2021, if you go back in time, you're going back to the year 2006. So in many ways, we have moonwalked back into the last decade. And this is just a reality. When we look closer at the labor market side of the oil and gas industry, this graph shows a sharp decline in persons with jobs in petroleum and gas, refining and service contractors for the period 2012 to 2020. And this is CSO source data. These data do not include the companies in Point Lisas which are lumped into manufacturing by CSO. But again, it shows a sharp decline in persons with jobs in the petroleum sector. Of course, you could see a sudden decline here after the third quarter of 2018. That big decline here is Petrotrin. It's the closure of the refinery and people at Petrotrin being sent home and so on. But generally, even without this big decline, which I attribute to Petrotrin, there would have been a large decline in the sector because of a reduction in offshore drilling activity and so on. This is showing LNG production, and the blue wedge at the bottom is Train 1 production. And Train 1 has been very much in the news, and you could see Train 1's production coming to an end somewhere around September 2020, and it has not restarted since. And it looks very likely that Train 1 will restart anytime soon. And generally, you could see LNG production in decline, and that's because gas production is in decline. This shows the reduction in drilling activity in Trinidad and Tobago. And you can see again, as drilling activity declines in the second half of the graph, you have a commensurate decline in gas production. And this final graph shows BPTT's drilling activity for the last 7 years. And again, you can see a significant decline in recent years. So the question is, why is the energy sector in decline? And what can we do about it? And the energy sector, in my opinion, it is incontrovertible and irrefutable that the sector has experienced significant declines since 2016. The statistical evidence to support that conclusion is obviously overwhelming. And the questions, the answers would be: one, we've had a lower price environment for that period of time, you would agree. That has changed in recent months. Prices have picked up. So one, you've had a lower price environment. Two, you have not had the fiscal regime in Trinidad and Tobago, which underpins this energy sector, reacting to that lower price environment. The third factor, in my opinion, is a major factor. We have had one bid round since 2014. That was the 2018-2019 average shallow water bid round. That bid round was a failure. It resulted in no acreage being awarded. And I've been hearing for the longest while that they're in some sort of negotiations with BP and Shell. I don't see anything coming out of that. And the fourth observation would be that the general relationship, in my opinion, between the government and the energy sector, which of course would include the upstream companies, BP and Shell and BHP and so on, and the companies in Point Lisas, I do not think it has been a cordial relationship. I do not think it has been a collaborative relationship. I don't expect that the government would hug up and jump and chip down the road with the companies in the energy sector, but I expect that there would be a collaborative spirit between the government and the sector that results in a win-win scenario for both the country and an alignment of interest, where a respectful alignment of interest. So I think that generally those are the things that have accounted for that decay and that decline in the last 6 years. And the question is, going forward as a country now, what do we do? And I just want to say that when, for example, I left office in 2015, gas production was 3.8 billion cubic feet of gas per day, and which wasn't perfect, but it's now 2.6 billion cubic feet of gas per day. It's going to recover a bit next year, but it is going to struggle to get anywhere beyond 3.2 billion cubic feet of gas per day. And so our gas sector is going to find it very difficult to recover to where it was in 2015, certainly not getting back anywhere close to where it was in 2010 at 4.3 billion cubic feet of gas per day. And the great hopes on the horizon for Trinidad and Tobago's gas sector would be the deep water exploration and appraisal program going on off Tobago's east to the northeast of Tobago, and Venezuelan gas from cross-border fields, which, as you know, is very much politically risky. There was an announcement in the budget debate in the Senate about the government and Shell coming to an agreement for a production sharing contract, for the terms of a production sharing contract for Manatee. I'd like to say that's good news for Trinidad and Tobago, but it should be caveated by a couple of things. One, they have not yet signed a production sharing contract, so there's a distance to travel still. Two, Shell has not sanctioned the project. And three, you would have to be blind not to see the political risk associated with developing a cross-border gas field. 73% of which is in Venezuelan waters. And while the Venezuelans have given their consent to Trinidad and Tobago and Shell developing our side of the border, there will always be political risk that has to be managed in such an arrangement. I mean, think about a mango tree growing on a boundary between two neighbors, and the two neighbors come to an agreement that Roger will pick his mangoes on his own and Kevin will pick his mangoes sometime later on when he has time. There's a high probability there of disagreement and conflict and so on, and we have to ask ourselves the question: how do we prepare to manage that sort of thing in the future? I also want to talk about TNTech because Dr. Gonzalez mentioned utilities. The utility rates in Trinidad and Tobago, as far as TNTech is concerned, were last revised in 2009. As far as WASA is concerned, utility rates were last revised in 1993. I mean, I can't fathom that. But it is becoming more and more evident that TNTech is headed in a direction where it could become, and I want to say that, I mean, I know some people may disagree with me, but TNTech is one of the more well-run state enterprises in Trinidad and Tobago from an operational point of view. We have in Trinidad and Tobago one of the best electricity sectors in the Caribbean in terms of reliability. I mean, people from other CARICOM jurisdictions would agree with me. But TNTech is now spending about $4 billion a year, I think it is, and they're earning about $3 billion a year. And on top of that, they have an ongoing issue with monies owed to NGC, which is an issue which goes back into my time as minister, predates my time as minister, and continues to this day. So in my view, it is inevitable that at some point in time, the country is going to have a rate increase in electricity rates. The RIC is currently in the process of doing their reviews for TNTech, and I expect that the RIC's work will be concluded in 2022. And I think that the government has signaled in the budget speech through the Minister of Finance, and the government has signaled through the Minister of Public Utilities, Minister Gonzalez, Minister Gonzalez, that a rate increase of TNTech is certainly on the cards. Secondly, there is the issue of WASA. I mean, again, I don't know how the utility continues to operate at 1993 rates. And finally, I would like to say that in both TNTech and WASA, there are inefficiencies which I think should be dealt with in tandem with giving those rate increases, because we don't want to give rate increases to TNTech and WASA, and those rate increases just simply are applied, the revenues from those rate increases are applied to mask inefficiencies in those two companies. So that's my contribution, and I'll be willing to answer any questions going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ramnarayan. Dr. Hussain?
Yes, good. So good evening. Thanks all for the opportunity to listen to these two very distinguished gentlemen. Very detailed understanding and insight into the Trinidad and Tobago economy from different angles. In many regards, Professor Gonzalez looked at the structure of the economy, but within the discussion of the structure of the economy, you saw his experience as a trade specialist come out, which I particularly find useful. And Kevin Ramnarayan, his experience as the former Minister of Energy and his translation of that experience into a sound understanding of the facts on the floor. Now, I would respond to both presentations, Rebecca, via a series of questions. It's not often that we get to to cross-examine each other. So I would use the opportunity to raise a few questions to Professor Gonzalez and Kevin. I would go with Kevin first.
Sure.
Kevin, are you hearing?
Oh, yeah, I'm hearing you.
So Kevin, what are three things, there's three questions, I'm going to call them out together. Kevin, what are three things you would do to increase oil production in Trinidad and Tobago? This is apart from the recent discovery, I think it was in the Ruby by BHP that would come on stream. What are three things you would do to increase oil production apart from that? Then within a 1 year period, what are three things you would do to increase service export opportunities to Guyana and Suriname? And do you think the moonwalk, which I found was very useful, should take place for transfers and subsidies as well? Do you want me to call out the questions for Dr. Gonzalez one time, Rebecca, or what?
We can,
Okay,
but
so let me give
Mr.
him a-
Amnaran, if he's ready to answer, we can give him an opportunity
So,
to answer.
Let me give him it, Professor Gonzalez, so whilst Kevin is responding, he could organize his notes.
Definitely,
And then I would
yes.
have, in so doing, relinquished the opportunity, given the opportunity for someone else to raise their questions. So my questions to Professor Gonzalez is, so you gave us a long way view, you went back to 1988 and traced the whole adjustment process, which we appreciated. So we are at 2021 now. What use would you make of the Venezuelans in recalibrating the economy? That's question number one. Number two, government expenditure is down to about 52 billion, and Minister Imbert, in all fairness to him, has been able to cut this from 63.8 billion to 52 billion and kept it there for a few years. And mind you, Professor Gonzalez and Kevin Ramnarine, this is nominal GDP. So in constant prices, nominal expenditure, so in constant prices term, it's even lower. And all due respect to the minister in that regard, but would you, given the gap, the persistent gap between government expenditure and government revenues, my view is that we should probably cut it from about 52 to about 45 with a reallocation within the cut budget in favor of capital outlay. I would like to hear your views on that. I would like to hear your views on how you would improve the labor force participation rate. I would like to hear, because you mentioned the non-booming tradable sector, I would like to hear how an informed practitioner like you, someone with so much experience, how would you go about doubling the size of the non-booming tradable sector within the next 3 years, Professor Gonzalez? I mean, these are the real issues on the table we need for an exchange. So if for some reason you were called upon to lead the effort to spearhead non-energy export revenues, how would you double non-energy export revenues within a 3-year period? And final question, well, two more. How would you prepare the economy, the Trinidad and Tobago economy, for a world that would soon be dominated at some point in the next 5 years, I'm guessing, let's say 7, by China? How do we make that transition? How do we prepare the Trinidad and Tobago economy for that? And finally, US dollars is US dollars. How would you increase the intensive and extensive margin of exports to CARICOM? Because even if we get US dollars from CARICOM, it's still US dollars. So if you were called in as a special advisor, given your expansive knowledge, and you had to say, and you said something like, okay, well, CARICOM is a low-hanging fruit, let's double exports there. How would you approach doubling exports there? This could perhaps be linked to the earlier question on doubling non-booming tradable exports altogether. So I know it's a lot, but it's thing that the public, I think, needs to hear from people like you and Kevin. So grateful for your feedback in that regard. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussain. Mr. Ramnarine, do you want to start off the responses?
Well, yeah, oil production. So what are the three things I would do? One, there has to be, the government has started after a very long time, after they were being told that they should do this since 2016, the government in 2020 started to reform supplemental petroleum tax. But they've done it in a very piecemeal way. They've changed it a bit for land production. Supplemental petroleum tax remains 33% of gross revenue for offshore oil production. So that renders certain projects offshore, and I know of two major offshore projects that cannot get off the ground because that SPT is too high. So the government has to decide whether they want a increasing slice, a larger slice of a shrinking pie, or they want a smaller slice of a growing pie. So I would reform supplemental petroleum tax, and I would be radical about that reformation of supplemental petroleum tax. I have looked at different approaches to it, and one of the approaches would be to have to actually suspend supplemental petroleum tax, Roger, for a 3-year period. And tell the oil companies, listen, we are suspending SPT for 3 years. You all make us proud, right? And if after 3 years, after 3 years, we could review it. But I think there has to be a radical approach to SPT. The second thing is that the lease operator farm out program, and I know the lease operator farm out program, one of the incarnations of it is something called the IPSC. And there's been some controversy around that, as you know. But by and large, the lease operator farm out program has been a huge success. And I think that's probably something that UE needs to do some research on, because it's a public-private approach to oil production. And I think Heritage Petroleum should be actively looking to give out more acreage or to joint venture with some of our local private sector companies to get more oil into production. Heritage Petroleum is a lot of its cash, a lot of the free cash that is generating from this current high oil price, I want to believe is going into paying Petrotrin's debts, right? So it doesn't leave them with much free cash to invest in producing new oil. So the way to go is lease operator farm out program and joint ventures and so on. And then finally, one of this, and again, it's a radical idea, and there's a lot of 3D seismic data, there's a lot of 2D seismic data available on Trinidad and Tobago that is kept in the catacombs of the Ministry of Energy, or the vaults of the Ministry of Energy. When companies do seismic, they have to, by license and by contract, share copies of the seismic with the Ministry of Energy. What has been happening in the more developed countries like Canada and so on is that seismic information is being made public. And that has actually had a revolutionary impact on oil production, in that when you make seismic data public, you allow independent geologists who may be at home and retired and so on, to go and download this seismic data and have a look at it. Because there's an old adage that oil is found in the minds of men. So I think the more men who are looking for oil is the more likely you are to find more oil. So I would make all seismic data, I would say 3 years after acquisition, publicly available to everybody. And what you would find is that more geologists looking at the data, you have a greater likelihood of people developing prospects and so on and taking it to companies. Then, of course, there's the whole ease of doing business, which I would say is a problem for the wider Trinidad and Tobago economy, but it is exacerbated in the energy sector because of the highly regulated nature of the sector. So there is within the energy sector, Roger, a significant ease of doing business issue. And if you sit and you talk to a company like Touchstone, which, as you know, is very actively involved in Ottawa, in the Ottawa block and so on, you would hear about some of the regulatory hurdles that they have to overcome. Finally, with regard to the export of energy services, it's something which, I have been working on for at different points in my life when I worked at the chamber and so on. And I would like to say that it is sometimes overlooked when we talk about exports, because when we talk about exports, we always think about physical goods. But we have a cadre of service companies in Trinidad who have been able to hold their own in places like Canada, in places like Brazil. Some of them have gone into Colombia and Venezuela and so on. A couple of them have gone into Ghana. So promoting energy services is important. Trinidad and Tobago has skills and expertise that it could obviously share with the emerging oil and gas powers of the region, and those would be Guyana and Suriname. And I think we really need to have a totally different meeting to talk about what's happening in Guyana and Suriname. So that would be my answers. I think, yes, Trinidad has skills and expertise that it could export to the world in oil and gas, and it's something that the government needs to pay careful attention to and promote. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank you very much, Kevin, as well.
Mr. Ramnarayan, and definitely we'll take you up on the suggestion to be able to ventilate some of these other possible linkage sectors associated with our mature energy sector in terms of what prospects are available in Guyana, in Suriname, and extra-regionally as well. Dr. Gonzalez, you can unmute your mic?
Yes. Okay. I missed the first question. I wasn't clear. I don't know if it's on my side or your side. And the last question, I wasn't too clear. I think
Dr. Hussain, would you mind just rereading your questions? The first one for Dr.
The
Gonzalez?
first one and the last one. The last one about
the first one was
exports to CARICOM.
No, the first one is of what use would you, if you became an advisor to the Ministry of Trade, what use would you make of the Venezuelan laborers? And the last one is linked to one of the others. CARICOM is a low-hanging fruit. We have a dominant presence in CARICOM. And you could get US dollars from Dominican, Antigua, and Barbuda, and Grenada, as well as from selling to the USA. In this crunch period, should we try to double up our manufacturing and other exports to the region, benefit from the common external tariff some more, and increase our non-energy foreign exchange inflow, whilst we put in place parallel measures to grow these firms extra-regionally?
So doubling up exports to CARICOM or non-energy exports to CARICOM. That's your point, in the first phase at least, yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, let's see. First of all, let me, I'll come back to this issue of the Venezuelan migrant labor. Let me deal with the second question, which talks about reducing the budget expenditure from 52 billion to 45 billion. And dividing up that 45 billion much with a proportion much more in favor of capital spending. Now, generally, we hear that there's not much discretion in terms of cutting public expenditure, because you have, first of all, a wage bill about 8 billion. You have a lot of social grants and transfers and so forth, which are very difficult to cut. And as a result, you don't have much scope to reduce the recurrent budget. Now, I tend to think that there is scope in terms of the utilities, and we just discussed that. Kevin pointed out, for instance, about $1 billion subsidy going to TNTech. The subsidy to WASA, I think, is probably much more than that. I don't have the exact figure in front of me. So there's at least 1 or 2 billion there that we could probably capture. There has to be some kind of scope for selling state assets and engaging in public-private sector partnerships On the last occasion when I was talking about the budget, I referred to the economic recovery report, in which they outlined a number of state assets, which were not basically strategic, which were ready for some kind of public-private sector participation. I think they listed about 5 or 6 of them. And they talked about raising $5 billion from these, selling these assets or engaging in public-private sector partnership. We have airports. We have the airport in Trinidad and Tobago. We have the airport in Piaco. We have the port. All of these assets could, in a way, bring in revenue in terms of engaging with the private sector. So I would say it is possible. First of all, and let me stress this. First of all, I wouldn't necessarily reduce the budget from 52 billion to 45 billion. I think there's scope for getting to 52 billion, but in another way, which is either through public-private partnerships or through increasing tax revenue. Tax revenue, we have $4 billion. That I think the tax gap in VAT is $4 billion. It's another 8 billion with respect to corporate and income tax. So there's a lot of scope outside there in terms of collecting, let's say that 7 billion that we're talking about. So my preference would really be to try to explore these sources a bit more. We talk about there's a property tax to come on stream. It's a difficult period now, but eventually that's to come on stream and some revenue could be raised there. But as I said, there is scope for reducing, even within the current context, there's still some scope in my view for reducing all these subsidies and all these transfers and bringing it down to something that is much more sustainable. So I would go there in terms of the utilities would be my first preference. I would look at certain sort of state transfers, which I think we could probably reduce or do without. I think there's some scope there. Government talk about the FCD, government have assets in Republic Bank. You know, there are the hotels, for example, the 3 hotels, Linton, Magdalena, and Hyatt, and so forth. All these assets are there, and I'm not sure that they're earning anything substantial for the government. So there's some scope. I mean, we have about 62 state enterprises, and we could do a lot more in terms of maximizing the returns from these assets than we're currently doing. So my preference would be to try to raise more revenue, at least to try to keep it at $52 billion. But as I said, there is scope within the current exercise, within the current expenditure to do some reduction. And I do not accept the argument that there's no discretion there at all. I think this is the argument you hear, there's not much discretion, you have this kind of fixed expenditure. The next question about the Venezuelan labor. The Venezuelan labor, as it stands right now, I don't have an exact figure. Some people put it at 60,000, some people put it at 24,000. We have several areas where we could productively use this Venezuelan labor. Agriculture, for example, is an area we are trying to go seriously into food security. And there's a lot of competitive import substitution we can do there. You see the situation now with food prices in the world and what is coming down the road. We need to get a lot more people into agriculture. And certainly, while we're going to technology advanced agriculture in terms of containerization or vertical agriculture and so forth, there's still a lot of scope for the use of labor. Agriculture will not overnight become a technology-driven thing, although we see some of the younger people going in that direction. So there's use for Venezuelan labor there. There's also use for Venezuelan labor in terms of manufacturing and the service industry. We see quite a number of them going into what we describe as the non-tradable sector, the bars, the restaurants, and so forth. But a lot of those areas, for example, have come under stress now with the foreign exchange crisis, the fall in demand, government is not spending as it used to be. So you find that a lot of them now, and especially since COVID, a lot of them have lost their jobs and they're going back home. Similar thing we saw, for example, in Colombia and in Ecuador and Peru. So my feeling is that the Venezuelan labor is an asset, and I agree insofar as one could pay them the basic minimum wage, and they can be very productive because they're happy to work for that particular wage. There's no exploitation there. Trinidad has had a problem of attracting labor at the minimum wage, and we saw even before COVID where we had to bring in a number of people from the other islands to do a number of things here in the service industry, things like gas stations and so forth, the hospitality industry and so forth. We had to employ a lot of labor from the rest of the region. So let's go for the Venezuelan labor here, not to mention the fact that we can use them a lot into the promoting exports. I see some of the manufacturing sectors are using some of them, they're retraining them, and again, retraining is important. I think one or two businesses are Point Research and so forth, maybe doing some of that to try to enhance their productivity. As regards the labor force participation, I have noted some observations about the labor force participation being very, 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 very high. We've had a loss of about 60,000 people have withdrawn from the labor force in the last the last decade or so forth, and we can't seem to account for them. I am not sure exactly if this is so, and what may be accounting for it. The thing is that the statistics are very poor. We don't account properly for the informal sector. The number of people, and some people I know personally and so forth, who are withdrawn from the labor force because it probably doesn't make sense to face the traffic and so on, especially if you have a couple of children and you have to look after them and so forth and pay for services to look after them. You withdraw and you probably look after them at home and you do what you might call a side job. You do something that would earn enough income. Your husband might, or your spouse may be working and maybe earning something which will allow you to probably get along. So I'm not clear exactly who's withdrawing from the labor force and not working. I think this is a modern society where people must have a job to live, and most people want to have a certain standard of living, and so they want to earn income. So I'm not sure people are going to withdraw from the labor force and just stay at home. But I'm not clear in my mind as to exactly what they're doing. But the informal sector in this society is pretty large. If we begin to include the underground economy and all that goes with it, and all the various kind of jobs that exist out there for people to earn income. So that is what I would say about that. And insofar as they may be able to use in the non-booming export sector, the non-energy sector, for example, certainly, I think if we get that sector to take off, by some new incentives, and let me come and link that to the question you asked about Dublin exports, because I think it's related. We have a problem of shifting these incentives. In a way, the incentives are shifting under the natural force of gravity, if you wish, that the changes in the economy. The whole blow to the non-tradable sector, the fall in the booming sector, and so forth. We are seeing some changes taking place. And this kind of bias, this kind of distorted way of giving incentives, as I mentioned, to the Exim Bank and so forth, we're trying to shift incentives. But in my view, this is not satisfactory. We need to do this in such a way that we provide the tradable sector, as I said, competitive substitutes in agriculture, as well as exportables. We provide them with a regime which makes it very profitable for them to go there rather than going into non-tradable things as malls and importing and all that kind of stuff. So the structure must be such, I think we have to look at sizably reducing taxation on people who are exporting in the non-energy sector, because the cost of exporting from a small economy is high, and we must provide them with a sizable amount of incentives for them to be able to make that shift. And the way I would do that is through the tax regime. I see we're doing this for agriculture, in the sense that we're paying little or no tax now in agriculture. But in a similar way, we need to do that for people who are exporting in the non-energy sector. And this applies both to goods and services. I think we need to make it very favorable. As you know, I'm a fan of some degree of depreciating the currency. And I believe that in this Big Bang idea of a sizable cut in the exchange rate, to start with at least, would send the right signal to people who want to go and do foreign exchange. So I think that this special regime is needed of incentives. We could talk about other ways of giving incentives through export credits or other kind of tax credits and so forth, and that would kind of encourage people to go into tradables. Now, with respect to the CARICOM market, I think right now we have a problem because these economies are in the doldrums as a result of COVID, the tourism phenomenon that we know about. So we can't expect too much. We're seeing them coming back slowly. I think it will take a little while. I'm not sure exactly when tourism will fully rebound, but we could probably think that within a year or so, they may be back. So at the present time, we have to work with them. It's a market which we're all familiar with. We have established distribution networks there. We want to maintain them. And as soon as they begin to respond, we have to move into them. In the meantime, we have to seek out other markets around the region, and particularly in Central America and in South America. We have markets there. We have been exploring trade agreements with these countries, but we have not been fully exploiting them. We have to make a much larger effort there. And I think recently the minister gave a report where she did show some kind of increase in non-energy exports. I wasn't clear what the base was, but she was trying to show where something is happening even in spite of COVID. And the Manufacturers Association has spoken about doubling exports in about 5 years or something like that. And we have a plan they're working on, and they're showing that you have some increase beginning to take place. We do have capacity and we do have potential to do some of this. But more has to be done in terms of providing the incentives. On the last occasion I spoke about, just before the budget, I spoke about how we could give export promotion a boost. We structured the export TT. I see they mentioned something in the budget there, about linking these two organizations and strengthening them, resourcing them a bit more. I think certainly an effort is needed there. We need a much more modern organization to do that kind of work. And there are lots of things in terms of establishing trade facilitation organizations abroad, like we have in Cuba. We need more of them. I heard the minister say that there's an intention to set up one in Central America, one in Jamaica, and in some other places, and so forth. A lot more could be done, and so forth. So my belief is that we may not be able to double exports to CARICOM within that time frame. I think you mentioned a few years or so, but we may not be able to do that given the current circumstances. But we can begin by looking at other countries. For instance, I've noticed Panama, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic have all come together to try to promote trade. And they're doing this largely because these countries are some of the fastest growing countries in the region. So there is where you stand a very good chance to export, because these economies are growing. Finally, and quickly, let me say something about China, about competing with China. I would say, first of all, that China is no longer the China it used to be, which is a labor-intensive country surviving on low wages. China is now moving up the income stream. It is going to become a middle income or a higher income country. We have to pay higher wages and so forth. And China is with its demographic trend in terms of the slower birth rate and so forth, China is turning much more to technology. So we have to look and try to begin to compete with China. We're not don't have to compete so much of them on low wage rates. We have to compete basically on skill and on technology, as well as culture. That is to extent. Some things, for example, if we sell to China now, like bitters and rums and things like that, these are essentially products based on specific culture and that you could sell there. I think we have to explore that with a bit more innovation. We can do business with China. But China is not, I'm not fearful of China as some of the other countries are. I think there's scope for a small economy like us to carve out niches and trade with China. We do have the natural resources, some of which we still sell there, like natural gas and asphalt and so forth. But there's scope for other things as we go forward. Thank you.
Dr. Gonzalez, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are getting close to our 8:30 mark, but I am going to allow our speakers to wrap up with a comment regarding the following. In Dr. Gonzalez presentation, he talked about structural reform being a process over which it's planned over a 40 to 50-year period. In terms of considering structural reform in the TNT case, what are some of those factors that are conditioning the conversation of structural reform? And I have a question here as well from the audience, and it is as follows. What can be done to agriculture to make it more substantial? So Dr. Gonzalez, I'd like you to take the question on the long wave view of structural reform as it applies to Trinidad and Tobago in terms of your wrap-up comments. And what are some of those factors that are conditioning that planning process or should condition that planning process? And Dr. Hussain, I'd like you to, in your wrap-up comments, tell me or tell the audience about what are some of those factors or interventions that can help us to expand the contribution of agriculture over time?
Yes, well, yes, the question about the process of structural reform, I would think that the biggest problem we have here is the experience we have had with structural reform that led to the 1990 coup. And this, ironically, I'm speaking about that and the death of Mr. Abubakar yesterday. I think to some extent the authorities are somewhat blinded by what occurred there, in that they tend to feel that they would not be able to handle the instability that could result from some of these reforms. I remember in 2014 we were discussing, I believe Dr. Hussain, you were chairing the session, we were discussing this question of the 2014 budget at a post-budget meeting on campus. And I raised the question about this question about the continuation of the reforms and what was happening. And I was told that, we have to remember what happened to all political leaders who engage in structural adjustment, from Mr. Manning in 1995 straight down to others, to the others. Mr. Robinson, sorry, before Mr. Manning. Mr. Manning lost the election in 1995, and subsequently, I am told that there's a concern that the population is very vulnerable, and that they don't endure social deprivation very easily, and they can easily turn against you in this kind of short-term politics. Every 5 years, they want, if you don't deliver certain things, they turn against you. I think that is probably psychologically our biggest problem. That is, we are fearful that if you remove energy subsidies, so and so will happen. I think the minister even said that when he removed, that's a small subsidy reform, and he said, well, nobody riot. As though he was probably even surprised that nobody riot. And so I think we have to explain to the population what has to be done in order for us to try to make that transition. And some of it do involve some hardship. And the point is that these things are best done when you have revenue. For instance, if we had started much earlier, we would not have had the situation that we have right now. Right now, it is more difficult because we have waited so long. These reforms should have been done since, as I said, the second generation reform should have started since in the 2000s, somewhere after that. And we would not have probably had this kind of situation. We would have built a larger HSF fund, because that is something I believe that we need to constantly keep building. And I hope if we do get another commodity super cycle, we can build that fund up to something like about $30–40 billion, because we see how useful it is, especially during these last couple of years with COVID and with the collapse of oil prices and so forth. You need a fund in order to carry you over the long term, in order to be able to sustain diversification and sustain growth. So my feeling is that there's that fear of social instability, that you need to have a social safety net of a certain size. And that in a way kind of inhibits any kind of initiative to really introduce these reforms. But there are more to it, I know, but we just don't have the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Gonzalez. Dr. Hussain, you can unmute your mic. And I'd just like to apologize on behalf of Mr. Ramnarayan. He had to leave. Dr. Hussain, unmute your mic.
So in relation to the agricultural sector expansion, as you know, we saw recently on the news that there's a shortage of seedlings. And in a depression with food prices rising, that's a kind of scary combination. Eh? We are in a depression and food prices are rising. Public policy should be such that you cannot run out of seedlings, or you shouldn't run out of seedlings. So my basic suggestion here, because I'm not an agricultural expert, is make seedlings available to the farmers, make seedlings available to the households throughout the country. And interestingly enough, Rebecca, I know you are involved in Shaw Foundation and you all are pushing a project like that. And make it available, make the foreign exchange available to buy seeds and hence have seedlings, because it's what will help you cut your food import bill when you have high food domestic inflation and a depression. So that's what I would say there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
What I would like to add, Rebecca, is I know we have run out of time, but for any of the graduate students that have any questions of relevance to trade for Professor Gonzalez, I would like to ask Professor Gonzalez if he could offer them the opportunity via you to forward the WhatsApp question to them, please.
Definitely. So students be guided accordingly. Yes. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this evening. I want to extend a heartfelt appreciation to all of our speakers in terms of extending their time and expertise. I would also like to thank them for wearing pink today. As you are aware, October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and we want to indicate that we stand in solidarity with the families who've been facing this challenge. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, do have a pleasant evening, and we want to encourage you to get vaccinated, practice social distancing, and do have a pleasant evening. Good night, everyone.
Good night, Rebecca.